cannot change anything unless we accept it. Condemnation does not liberate, it oppresses. Carl Jung.
There are people in your life who will never tell you they dislike you. They'll smile when you walk into the room. They'll answer your texts. They may congratulate you when something goes well. And if you ask them directly whether there was a problem, they would probably look surprised. But something has changed.
The joke has a little more bite than it used to. Your success gets explained away as luck. Your mistakes seem strangely memorable.
When you speak, there's a subtle impatience in the room. When you set a boundary, you're suddenly difficult. When you stop explaining yourself, you've changed. Nothing dramatic enough to confront, just enough to feel. And most people make a predictable mistake when this happens. They immediately start searching themselves for the offense. What did I do? Maybe you did something. That possibility should never be dismissed. But Carl Jung's psychology points toward a far more uncomfortable explanation for certain forms of hostility. Sometimes people are not reacting to what you have done to them. They are reacting to what they experience in themselves when you are around. Jung spent much of his work examining the distance between the person we consciously believe ourselves to be and the parts of ourselves we would rather not recognize. We want to think of ourselves as generous, so envy becomes difficult to admit. We want to believe we are confident, so insecurity gets hidden. We want to see ourselves as independent, so our hunger for approval disappears underground. Jung associated these rejected qualities with what he called the shadow. And rejected does not mean destroyed. What we refuse to recognize in ourselves has a strange way of appearing somewhere else, especially in other people. That changes the meaning of certain relationships. Because someone does not always need to insult you, betray you, or compete with you openly in order to resent you. Sometimes you only have to represent something they have been trying not to think about. Your discipline can remind someone of their excuses. Your independence can disturb someone who was comfortable with your dependence. Your boundaries can expose how much another person benefited from you having none. Even your willingness to change can become painful to someone who has spent years convincing themselves that change was impossible. And none of this means you are somehow superior. In fact, believing that everyone who dislikes you must secretly envy you can become its own form of blindness. Jung's ideas become much more disturbing when they are taken seriously, because the shadow belongs to you as well. You project, you envy, you misread people, you have motives you would rather not examine. So the real question is not simply, why do people secretly hate you? The deeper question is much harder. How can you tell when another person is reacting to their shadow and when they are showing you something about your own? Because once you understand that distinction, those strange silences, subtle insults, shifting friendships, and unexplained changes in people's behavior begin to look very different. And the first place we have to look is where hatred usually begins. Not in open conflict, but in the things nobody is willing to say. Hatred rarely arrives looking like hatred. If it did, human relationships would be much easier to understand. Someone would insult you, betray you, openly compete with you, and the situation would become clear. You would know where you stood. But some of the most psychologically revealing forms of hostility are almost invisible. They appear in the friend who celebrates your failure with slightly too much enthusiasm, the co-worker who compliments you in public, then quietly undermines your credibility, the relative who keeps turning your accomplishments into jokes, the person who once seemed comfortable around you but now becomes strangely tense whenever you speak with confidence. Nothing is explicit. That is precisely what makes it so confusing. You begin collecting tiny pieces of evidence while simultaneously arguing against yourself. Maybe you're imagining it. Maybe they're tired. Maybe that comment meant nothing. Maybe you're becoming too sensitive.
Sometimes those explanations are correct, but Jung's psychology offers another possibility. Human beings do not encounter one another objectively.
We encounter people through the complicated machinery of our own fears, desires, memories, insecurities, and unconscious conflicts. In other words, someone can react intensely to you without fully understanding why. This becomes easier to understand through Jung's idea of the persona. The persona is the social face we construct in order to function in the world. It isn't necessarily fake. You behave differently in a job interview than you do alone in your kitchen at midnight, and that doesn't make you dishonest. Social life requires some degree of adaptation. The problem begins when we confuse the mask with the entire person. Someone may need to believe they are generous while secretly keeping score. Another person may build an identity around being confident while desperately needing admiration. Someone may pride themselves on being humble while privately resenting anyone who receives more attention. The persona says, "This is who I am," but somewhere underneath it, another voice knows the story is incomplete. And then you enter the picture. Perhaps you possess something they want. Perhaps you stop behaving in a way that once made them comfortable. Perhaps you remind them of a decision they regret. Or maybe there is simply something about you that touches a psychological nerve neither of you can immediately identify. Suddenly, the emotional temperature changes. The important point is that this reaction doesn't have to be conscious. A person does not need to sit at home thinking, "I resent this person," because their confidence reminds me of my insecurity. The mind is rarely that cooperative. Instead, discomfort searches for an explanation that protects the conscious identity. So the feeling becomes a judgment. You're arrogant. You're annoying. You're trying too hard. You think you're better than everyone. And perhaps sometimes those criticisms are true. That possibility matters, and we'll return to it later. But sometimes the accusation performs another function. It gives an internal discomfort and external target. This is where ordinary dislike becomes psychologically interesting, because you may be defending yourself against an accusation that was never really created by your behavior. You are arguing with the surface explanation why something entirely different is happening underneath. And if that is true, then trying harder to be liked may accomplish very little. You can become quieter, more agreeable, more accommodating. You can explain your intentions until you're exhausted, yet the tension remains. Because the real problem may not be something you said. It may be something you reflect. And to understand why another human being can experience you as a mirror without either of you consciously realizing it, we have to move beyond the persona and into the part of Jung's psychology most people would rather discuss in theory than encounter in themselves, the shadow. Jung understood something unsettling about human beings. We are often much better at recognizing unwanted qualities in other people than recognizing them in ourselves. This is where the shadow becomes important. The shadow contains aspects of ourselves that our conscious identity has difficulty accepting. Anger we were taught to suppress, envy that contradicts our image of being generous, a hunger for recognition we consider embarrassing. Insecurity hidden beneath confidence, ambition disguised as indifference. These qualities don't simply disappear because we refuse to identify with them. They remain psychologically active, and sometimes another person brings them painfully close to the surface. Imagine two friends who have spent years talking about everything they intend to do someday. Change careers, get healthier, leave relationships that make them miserable, take their ambitions seriously. Then one of them actually begins.
No speeches, no motivational posts, no attempt to make the other person feel inadequate. They simply change.
At first, the friend may appear supportive, but gradually something shifts. You've become obsessed. You never relax anymore. You're not the same person. The strange thing is that the person who changed may never have criticized the friend at all. They didn't need to. Their behavior created the comparison. Your discipline can make someone aware of their avoidance without you saying a word. Your willingness to leave an unhealthy situation can remind someone of what they continue tolerating. Your ability to say no can confront someone with all the times they said yes because they were terrified of rejection. You become a mirror they never asked to look into, and mirrors are neutral. What matters is what appears inside them. Jung used the concept of projection to describe part of this psychological process. Qualities and conflicts that are difficult to recognize internally can be experienced as though they belong primarily to someone outside us. This helps explain a strange feature of resentment. The intensity of the reaction sometimes exceeds the apparent cause. Someone isn't merely uninterested in your success, they need to diminish it. You weren't simply confident, you were showing off. You didn't establish a boundary, you became selfish. You didn't change direction. You suddenly think you're better than everyone. Again, this does not mean every criticism is projection. But when another person's reaction seems unusually emotional, repetitive, or disconnected from what actually happened, Jung gives us a question worth asking. What does this person experience when they encounter me? Not because you are extraordinary, not because everyone secretly envies you, but because human beings compare themselves constantly, often without admitting it. And sometimes what hurts isn't another person's success itself, it's the abandoned possibility that success represents. The life you're building may resemble the life someone once imagined for themselves. Your freedom may remind them of a cage they helped construct. Your honesty may disturb an arrangement they survive by pretending not to see. That is why certain people become colder as you become clearer. But there is an even deeper problem. A mirror only becomes truly threatening when it stops behaving the way you expect. And as you become less dependent on approval, the people around you don't merely see something different in you. They begin losing the version of you that once served a role in their lives. Every relationship has rules nobody remembers agreeing to. One person is always the peacemaker, another is the one everyone rescues, someone makes the jokes, someone absorbs the criticism, someone apologizes first even when they did nothing wrong. Over time, these roles become so familiar that they stop looking like roles. They start looking like personality. And this is why personal growth can create consequences you never expected. Suppose you've spent years needing someone's approval. You explain your decisions because you want them to understand. You tolerate disrespect because conflict makes you anxious. When they become distant, you chase them. When they criticize you, you immediately examine yourself. Without realizing it, the relationship develops an emotional economy. They withdraw, you pursue, they disapprove, you explain. They make demands, you accommodate. Then one day you stop, not dramatically. There is no speech, no confrontation, no announcement that you've become a different person. You simply stop participating in the old exchange. And suddenly someone who seemed perfectly comfortable with you becomes irritated. Why? Because when you change your role, you change the relationship. Consider the person who says you become cold because you no longer answer every call immediately, or the family member who accuses you of selfishness after you finally say no, or the friend who insists you've changed because you no longer laugh at insults disguised as jokes. From your perspective, you've established a boundary. From theirs, something has been taken away. Access, influence, predictability, perhaps even the comforting certainty that they could behave a certain way and you would always respond exactly as expected. This doesn't necessarily make them cruel or calculating. Much of this happens without conscious intention. People become accustomed to emotional arrangements just as they become accustomed to furniture in a room. They notice the chair only when someone removes it. And sometimes you were the chair, reliable, convenient, always there. Growth disrupts that convenience. The more psychologically independent you become, the harder you are to control through disappointment, guilt, silence, praise, or withdrawal. The old buttons are still being pressed, but they no longer produce the same response. That can feel deeply unsettling to someone who knew the previous version of you, so they may attempt to bring that version back. You used to be more fun. You've gotten difficult. I don't even recognize you anymore. Listen carefully to statements like these. Sometimes they express genuine grief. People can sincerely miss who you were, and not every painful reaction is manipulation. But sometimes what they miss isn't you. They miss the access they had to you, and this is where growth becomes socially expensive. We like imagining self-development as an individual journey. You become stronger, healthier, clearer, and everyone who loves you applauds. Real relationships are more complicated. When one person changes, an entire system must adjust. Some people adjust with you. Others unconsciously fight to restore the old balance. And this creates a dangerous temptation. Once you notice these patterns, it's easy to conclude that every person disturbed by your growth must be insecure, controlling, or threatened by you. That conclusion feels empowering. It can also become another form of blindness. Because sometimes the person resisting your behavior isn't revealing their problem. They're revealing yours. There is a point where self-awareness can quietly become self-deception. You learn about projection. You recognize resentment. You notice how some people react when you establish boundaries or stop seeking their approval. And gradually, a very seductive explanation becomes available. Anyone who dislikes you must be threatened by you. The coworker who criticizes you, insecure, the friend who distances themselves, jealous, the partner who confronts you, controlling, the family member who says you've changed. They simply can't handle your growth. It's an attractive worldview because it transforms rejection into evidence of superiority. And that is exactly why it is dangerous. Sometimes people really are disturbed by qualities in you that expose something unresolved in themselves. Sometimes your boundaries frustrate people who benefited from your lack of boundaries. Sometimes your progress does awaken envy. But if every criticism becomes projection, you have created a psychological system in which you can never be wrong. Think about how convenient that is. If someone praises you, they understand you. If someone criticizes you, they're threatened by you. If they stay, they recognize your value. If they leave, they couldn't handle your authenticity. No evidence can penetrate the story. At that point, what looks like self-knowledge has become armor. And there is a darker irony here. The person convinced that everyone else is projecting may be projecting more than anyone in the room. Maybe you aren't being rejected because you're independent. Maybe you've become emotionally unavailable. Maybe you're not brutally honest. Maybe you enjoy being brutal and use honesty as permission. Maybe what you call boundaries are sometimes punishments. Maybe your refusal to explain yourself isn't confidence but fear of accountability. These possibilities are uncomfortable because they remove the easiest character from the story, the enlightened victim surrounded by unconscious people. Real psychological maturity is less flattering. It requires you to hold two possibilities at once. Someone may be reacting to their own unresolved conflict, and they may also be telling you something true. Consider a friend who says you've become arrogant since becoming successful. You could immediately decide that your success triggers their insecurity. Perhaps it does, but what if you've also started interrupting them? What if you subtly dismiss their problems? What if every conversation eventually returns to your achievements? Their envy would not automatically make their criticism false. Human motives are rarely pure enough for that. A person can envy you and accurately perceive your arrogance. Someone can fear your independence and correctly notice your selfishness. Someone can resent your boundaries and still be right that you communicate them cruelly. Two uncomfortable truths can occupy the same room. This is why the strongest person isn't the one who becomes immune to criticism. It's the person who can examine criticism without immediately surrendering to it or defending against it. You ask, is there evidence? Have other people I trust noticed the same pattern? Does this criticism describe something specific, or is it merely an attack on my character? Am I angry because the accusation is absurd, or because some part of it landed? That last question can be especially difficult, because sometimes the comment that stays in your mind for 3 days isn't the cruelest one. It's the one that came too close. Self-knowledge therefore requires something more difficult than identifying other people's shadows. It requires becoming suspicious of the stories that always make you innocent. Otherwise, personal growth becomes another performance. You stop wearing the mask of the agreeable person and replace it with the mask of the awakened person. Now you're the one who sees through everyone. You're too evolved for ordinary relationships, too independent to explain yourself, too authentic to compromise. The mask changed, the blindness didn't. So when someone begins to dislike you, don't automatically shrink yourself to regain their approval. But don't automatically crown yourself either. Look carefully. Listen without surrendering your judgment. Examine yourself without accepting every accusation. Because the real freedom isn't reaching a point where nobody can hurt your self-image. It's reaching a point where your self-image no longer needs protection from the truth. And once you can do that, another possibility appears. Perhaps the goal was never to make everyone like you. Perhaps it was to become someone who no longer needs either their admiration or their hatred to tell you who you are. At some point, a difficult realization begins to change the way you move through the world. Not everyone who dislikes you has misunderstood you. Not everyone who criticizes you is projecting. And not everyone who walks away needs to be brought back. Once you accept those three things, approval starts losing some of its power. Most people don't realize how much of their personality has been negotiated with an invisible audience. They choose their words carefully, hide certain opinions, laugh when something isn't funny, stay available when they're exhausted, explain decisions that require no explanation. Not because they're weak, because belonging matters. Human beings learn early that acceptance has conditions. Families have them, friendships have them, workplaces have them, romantic relationships have them. Be this version of yourself and everything remains comfortable. Change too much and the atmosphere changes with you. That is why becoming more psychologically independent can feel strangely lonely at first. You're no longer willing to betray yourself for acceptance, but you haven't yet discovered which relationships can survive your honesty. Some won't. And this is where many people panic. They feel the distance growing and immediately return to their old performance. They become agreeable again, available again, quiet again. They reopen doors they had good reasons to close. The reward arrives quickly, the tension disappears, everyone seems comfortable again, except you. Because there is a particular exhaustion that comes from being loved for a version of yourself you can no longer tolerate being. Eventually, the more important question stops being, how do I make them understand me? It becomes, what does this relationship require me to become in order to keep it? That question reveals a great deal. Healthy relationships can survive disagreement. They can survive boundaries. They can survive growth. They can even survive periods of distance, because neither person needs complete control over who the other becomes. Unhealthy relationships often depend on repetition. You must remain predictable. Keep playing your role. Keep needing the same approval. Keep tolerating the same behavior. And if you change, the relationship begins treating your development as betrayal. But psychological independence does not mean becoming cold. It doesn't mean refusing compromise, dismissing criticism, or walking away whenever someone makes you uncomfortable. That's merely another prison disguised as freedom. Real independence is quieter. You can hear criticism without collapsing. You can be misunderstood without writing a 10-page defense. You can apologize when you're wrong without feeling diminished. You can lose someone's approval without immediately losing your own. And perhaps most importantly, you can examine your own resentment with the same seriousness you apply to everyone else's. Because you are also someone else's mirror. There will be people whose confidence irritates you, people whose success awakens comparison, people whose freedom exposes compromises you've made. When that happens, you face the same choice everyone else faces. Attack the mirror or examine what appeared inside it. That may be the dividing line between awareness and self-deception. The goal isn't to reach a place where rejection no longer hurts. It probably will. The goal is to stop treating every rejection as a verdict. Some people will dislike the person you're becoming because your changes disturb something in them. Others will dislike you for reasons worth hearing. Some relationships will end because you finally establish boundaries. Others may end because you fail to recognize your own behavior soon enough. Maturity is learning to tell the difference, and when you can do that, something unexpected happens. You stop asking everyone around you to confirm your identity. Praise becomes pleasant but not necessary. Criticism becomes information but not a command. Rejection becomes painful, but not proof that you should abandon yourself. You finally understand why being disliked was never the deepest danger. The deeper danger was spending your entire life becoming whatever other people needed you to be, so they would never have a reason to dislike you. And once that fear loses its authority, the mirror remains, but you no longer have to look away. If you've stayed with me this far, thank you. Not simply for watching, but for being willing to sit with an idea that doesn't offer an easy villain or a comfortable answer. It's much easier to examine the resentment of other people than to question our own, and it's much easier to chase approval than to ask what we're sacrificing to receive it. So if this conversation made you recognize something in a relationship, in someone else's behavior, or perhaps in yourself, then the time you spent here mattered. Thank you for giving these ideas your attention, and more importantly, for being willing to look into the mirror without immediately turning away. If this video gave you a different way to understand resentment, rejection, or the people who suddenly seem uncomfortable when you begin to change, leave your interpretation in the comments. Have you ever watched a relationship change after you started setting boundaries or stopped seeking someone's approval? And if you value conversations that explore the parts of human behavior we usually avoid discussing, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Not because an algorithm needs another offering, although apparently it always does, but because there are still much deeper places for us to go. And there is one question we haven't answered. What happens when the person manipulating your perception isn't an obvious enemy, but someone close enough to know exactly where your doubts live? Because some people don't need to openly attack you to control you. They only need to make you stop trusting your own interpretation of reality. The video appearing on your screen explores that psychological territory, and once you recognize the pattern, certain relationships may become impossible to see the same way again.